The morning air clung heavy with grief as dozens of mourners stood in silence, surrounded by rows of white marble headstones stretching endlessly across Arlington National Cemetery. A cold breeze swept through the trees, rustling the dying leaves like whispers from souls long gone. In the center of it all, Sergeant First Class Thomas Ennio knelt beside a flag-draped coffin. His uniform was immaculate, medals gleaming, posture steady, but his eyes betrayed a man slowly unraveling. One hand gripped the collar of a German shepherd at his side. The other trembled slightly over the coffin. The dog, Ranger, didn't move, not until he let out a long, guttural howl that seemed to cut through the bones of every soul present. The howl was not a cry. It was a scream no one could understand but everyone felt. It was mourning wrapped in confusion, as if the dog sensed something the rest of the world had missed. Ranger, once trained to detect IEDs and human scent buried deep beneath rubble and sand, now stared unblinking at the polished wood of the casket. Thomas closed his eyes, clutching the dog's neck. He had buried friends before, had stood just like this countless times. But this time it was different. This time it was Captain David Carson, his commander, his best friend, the man who pulled him from a burning convoy in Kandahar and said, "You die when I say so, soldier." And today's not that day. As taps began to play from the bugler behind them, Ranger's body stiffened. He growled, a deep, uncharacteristic sound. Then he lunged. Thomas barely held him back as the dog barked twice, sharply, desperately, eyes locked on the coffin. People turned. The mourners shifted uncomfortably. The sound of the trumpet faltered for a beat. Thomas whispered under his breath, "Easy, boy." But Ranger wouldn't be calmed. His nose twitched, his ears flattened, and then he began to scratch at the ground, frantic, like trying to dig through time itself. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. Not just instinct wrong, gut wrong. He looked around, waiting for someone to say something, to explain, to make it make sense. But no one moved. Then, just as the folded flag was being handed to David's sister, it happened. A faint thud. Once, twice, 3 times. From inside the coffin, everything stopped. Eyes widened. A woman gasped. Ranger barked again, louder this time, clawing the earth. Thomas stood slowly, adrenaline roaring in his veins. He had heard that sound before, in bunkers, in collapsed buildings, in body bags that were zipped too soon. But never here. Never in America. The funeral director froze mid-step. A Marine dropped the flag. And then, from the casket, a dragging sound, followed by a hoarse tap. Thomas's mouth went dry. His hand reached out instinctively. A whisper of wood moved, and a finger, bruised and bloody, emerged from beneath the coffin lid. The silence shattered. People screamed. One mourner collapsed to the ground. Ranger howled again, but this time it was not grief. It was rage, protection, warning. Thomas turned to the honor guard. "Open it. Now!" he barked. In that instant, he knew this wasn't just a mistake. This was something far more terrifying. The man they thought they were burying wasn't dead. Chaos erupted around the grave as the tightly rehearsed ceremony unraveled in a storm of disbelief. The honor guard, once statues of discipline, now moved with urgent confusion. One of them dropped his rifle while another ran toward the funeral director shouting for tools. Ranger paced in tight circles, barking with frantic precision, as if urging time to move faster. Thomas stayed rooted at the foot of the casket, his eyes locked on the impossible image. Captain David Carson's trembling, dirt-stained finger forcing its way through a sliver in the coffin lid. It was a moment frozen in time, suspended between the dignity of death and the desperate gasp of a man clawing his way back to life. The lid creaked as it was pried open, inch by inch, the sound splintering through the crisp morning like a scream no one wanted to hear. David's face appeared, pale, drenched in sweat, with lips bluish from lack of oxygen and eyes wide with terror. His chest rose in short, rapid bursts, lungs starving for air. He coughed violently, the kind of cough that sounded like it belonged in a war zone, not beneath a flag on American soil. For a moment, everyone stared, as if trying to process whether this was real or the ghost of guilt rising from a man they buried too soon. But then David spoke, his voice rasping like gravel in his throat. "Don't close it, please." Thomas's knees buckled. He dropped beside the coffin, tears springing to his eyes without warning. "Jesus, David, how?" he whispered, hands trembling as he gripped the edge. David blinked slowly, his eyes rolling as if his body was fighting to stay conscious. A medic, finally breaking through the stunned crowd, climbed over the lowered ropes and checked his vitals. "He's alive," she said breathlessly. "Barely, but he's alive." The crowd gasped again. Several mourners began to cry, hands over their mouths, while others simply stood paralyzed in shock. The sound of distant bagpipes, meant for another funeral nearby, drifted eerily through the trees. As the stretcher was rushed forward and David was carefully lifted from the coffin, Ranger whimpered and moved closer, nuzzling the man's hand. David stirred at the touch, his lips twitching into something that might have been a smile or a grimace of pain. "Knew I'd hear him," he murmured. "Ranger didn't let me go." His voice broke. So did Thomas. His grip tightened around Ranger's collar, grounding himself in the only two constants he had left: the war dog beside him and the friend who had just returned from the dead. But as the medics worked, Thomas noticed something strange. A small red mark on David's neck. Not a wound. Puncture. Clean. Precise. Not military. Not natural. He stared, heart pounding. Something was wrong. This wasn't a mistake. Someone wanted David dead. And buried. At the hospital, sterile lights hummed overhead as David Carson lay unconscious, hooked to a tangle of 4 lines and monitors that beeped steadily, marking his fragile return to life. Thomas sat by his side, still in full dress uniform, fists clenched on his knees. Ranger lay at his boots, unmoving now, eyes fixed on the hospital bed. The image of the puncture on David's neck haunted Thomas. Clean, deliberate, and in a place no medic would ever insert a line. That wasn't a mistake. It was a message, or worse, a warning. The doctors called it a miracle. Said David must have suffered a rare cataleptic episode. His vitals so faint they were mistaken for death. But Thomas had seen men die. He'd zipped up bags himself, felt for pulses through blood-soaked flesh. David hadn't looked like someone slipping quietly into a coma. He looked like someone who'd been silenced. And if Ranger hadn't sensed it, if he hadn't howled, barked, dug like a creature possessed, David would have been in the ground by now, and no one would have questioned it. As night fell, Thomas finally stood and left the room, walking down a quiet corridor lined with polished floors and faded photos of old generals. He needed air. Or answers. Maybe both. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Major Carla Henson, retired intelligence. They'd served together in Kabul. She picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp, alert. "Tom? You don't call unless someone's dead. Or not dead enough." He told her everything: David's death, the tapping, the mark on his neck. There was a pause. Then, "That mark, it sounds like a T-29 injection point. That's not standard military. That's Black Ops level. Off-book stuff." Thomas's blood ran cold. "You're saying someone injected him with something to make him appear dead?" Carla didn't answer right away. "I'm saying I've seen things, Tom. Things that don't get written down." If Carson knew something, if he was about to talk. Her voice trailed off, and Thomas could hear her pour a drink. "You need to find out what he was involved in before the wrong people realize he's breathing again." Back in the hospital room, David stirred for the first time in hours. His lips moved, mumbling through a haze of pain and sedation. Thomas leaned in, heart thudding. "David, can you hear me?" A whisper came back, barely audible. "They think I saw something. Afghanistan." It wasn't what we were told. Thomas's stomach turned. The air in the room thickened, as if reality itself had shifted. And then, through the crack in the doorway, Thomas saw it. Someone watching. A man in a black suit, standing silently in the hallway. disappearing the moment their eyes met. Thomas bolted from the hospital room, his boots echoing down the sterile corridor as he chased the man in the black suit. But by the time he turned the corner, the hallway was empty. Just flickering lights and a custodian pushing a mop with a blank expression. He scanned every door, every exit. Nothing. No badge. No ID. No trace. Just a gut-deep certainty that whoever that was, he wasn't supposed to be there. And he wasn't here for sympathy. He was watching David, like a vulture circling something that wasn't quite dead yet. Back in the room, Thomas locked the door. He sat beside David, heart still racing. Ranger stood alert again, pacing in small circles, ears perked, eyes trained on the hallway as if expecting that man to return. Thomas leaned in close, whispering urgently. "What did you see, David? Why would someone want you dead before you could talk?" David's eyelids fluttered. He tried to speak but coughed, his body still too weak. But in that brief moment of lucidity, his hand reached up and gripped Thomas's sleeve. "They buried something out there. Not just bodies," he rasped. "Files. Orders. It's all connected to the drone strike. The one that went wrong." Thomas blinked hard. That strike. It was one of the darkest days of their deployment, when intel led them to level a village in Helmand province. Command called it a clean-op. Thomas remembered the silence that followed. No celebrations. No confirmations. Just a blackout. No one ever talked about it again. But David had always questioned it. Even years later, he said something didn't feel right. That civilians were caught in the blast. That maybe it wasn't the enemy they eliminated that day, but witnesses. Thomas's phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from an unknown number. "You saw him. That was a mistake." He stared at it, ice pouring into his chest. He didn't show it to anyone, just deleted it. But the message burned behind his eyes. Someone out there knew David was alive, and they weren't done with him. Thomas stepped out into the hallway again and asked to speak with hospital security. But when they checked the footage, there was nothing. No man in a black suit. No shadow in the hall. Just static during the exact minutes Thomas swore he saw him. Later that night, while David finally slept, Thomas found himself watching him breathe. Each inhale felt like borrowed time. He looked at Ranger, who hadn't taken his eyes off the door. That dog knew. Somehow he knew. And Thomas realized something bone deep. They were being watched. Not just at the hospital. Everywhere. And if they wanted to survive, they'd have to disappear. But before they could plan their next move, the hospital room phone rang. It was unmarked. Thomas picked up slowly. A voice on the other end said only one thing. "If he talks, he dies for real next time." Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat rigid in the corner of the hospital room, his eyes flicking between David's sleeping form and the shadows outside the window. Ranger lay across the doorway like a guardian from another world. His breathing steady, but every so often, his ears would twitch and his head would lift, sniffing the air like it might betray a hidden enemy. Thomas knew that voice on the phone hadn't been bluffing. Whoever they were, they had eyes everywhere. And now, David was more than a survivor, he was a liability. By sunrise, Thomas had made up his mind. He wasn't going to wait around for another miracle to fail. He slipped out of the room, found the head nurse, and told her David needed to be moved to a veterans-only facility. It was a lie, of course, but he flashed his old ID, added just enough urgency to his tone, and it worked. Within the hour, a hospital transport van had been arranged. Thomas insisted on handling the transfer himself. No outside paramedics. No questions. He signed every form with the calm of a soldier on a mission he couldn't afford to fail. Because this wasn't about following orders anymore. This was about saving the last man who ever had his back. They drove for hours. David was weak but conscious, his face pale, his body still shaking off whatever poison had been coursing through it. Ranger never left his side, head on David's chest like he was holding his soul in place. They passed small towns, long stretches of forest, and abandoned military checkpoints from another era. Finally, Thomas pulled off onto an unmarked dirt road and drove another mile before stopping at a small, weathered cabin tucked deep in the woods. It had belonged to his grandfather, once a ranger himself, long before the wars overseas. No one knew it was there. No one ever would. Inside, Thomas laid David down on the cot and started locking windows, covering them with blackout curtains, sealing the place like a bunker. He checked his old sat phone, no signal, just static. Good. No tracking. David opened his eyes slowly and looked around, confused. Where are we? He whispered. Thomas crouched beside him. Somewhere no one can find you. For now. David blinked, tears building at the corners. They'll come. You know that, right? Thomas nodded slowly. Let them. That night, Thomas sat outside on the porch, shotgun across his lap, watching the treeline. The silence was thick, too thick. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind through the pine needles made his pulse spike. He was a soldier again. Not for a country, not for a flag, for a friend. And as the moon rose over the trees, something caught Ranger's attention. He stood slowly, ears up, growling low at the darkness beyond the trees. And then headlights, approaching. No road, no sound, just light slicing through the forest. The headlights cut through the thick trees like searchlights from a hunter's plane, sweeping side to side across the forest floor. Thomas stood instantly, the cold steel of the shotgun heavy in his hands. Ranger growled louder now, body rigid, tail stiff. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't an accident, and it damn sure wasn't help. No road led to that cabin. No one knew about this place. Except now, someone did. Thomas backed toward the cabin slowly, eyes locked on the light as it grew brighter. The engine was low, almost electric, too quiet for a regular vehicle. David was barely able to sit up inside, and Thomas knew he couldn't run. Not like this. They found us, he said flatly. Reaching into the cabinet for the handgun, he kept wrapped in an old flannel shirt. He tossed it onto the bed near David, who blinked at it with wide, fearful eyes. If they get through me, don't let them take you alive. For a moment, silence fell. The lights stopped moving. The engine idled. Thomas peeked through the edge of the curtain and saw them. 3 figures, all in black, stepping silently out of a matte SUV with no plates. No insignia. Military posture, but not standard gear. No flashes of rank. No names. Just masks. The kind of men who didn't exist on paper. Men trained to clean up the kind of mistakes the government never admitted to making. David was that mistake. Ranger barked violently, launching himself toward the front door, teeth bared. Thomas grabbed his collar just in time. Not yet, boy. Not yet. He turned to David. You said they buried something. What was it? What did you see? David coughed, struggling to keep his voice. A bunker, under the blast site. Civilians were hiding there. But that's not the part they wanted gone. It was files, hard drives. They were documenting something, our operations. Every strike, every casualty. Unfiltered. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. And you got near it? David nodded weakly, long enough to see the names. Outside, footsteps crunched over leaves. Slow, calculated. Thomas knelt behind the window, watching the shadows move. One of the masked men lifted a device, some kind of scanner, and pointed it toward the cabin. It beeped once, softly, confirming something. Thomas cursed under his breath. They're not here to talk. Then, a voice echoed from outside, calm, amplified, deliberate. Sergeant Ennio, you're harboring classified intelligence. Step out with the asset, and this ends quietly. Thomas looked at David, at Ranger, then back at the door. He didn't speak, just pumped the shotgun once, slowly, and whispered, then I guess we're not ending quietly. The night shattered in a burst of light as the first flashbang exploded just outside the cabin. The blast shook the floorboards, sending Ranger into a defensive frenzy and Thomas into instinct mode. He grabbed David by the collar and dragged him to the floor just as the window above them shattered, spraying glass across the room like shrapnel. Smoke began to fill the air, thick, white, chemical. and Thomas couldn't tell if the tears in his eyes were from the gas or the fear building like fire in his chest. They had breached the perimeter faster than he expected. The first masked man came through the back door, silent and swift. But Thomas was faster. One shotgun blast center mass sent the man crashing into the frame, motionless. Ranger darted into the smoke like a phantom, disappearing into the chaos, and the sound of snarling and a sharp human scream followed. Thomas didn't have time to look. He pulled David toward the crawl space under the floorboards, an old survival trick from his grandfather's time. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice shaking for the first time in years. "Don't come out unless you hear my voice. You understand?" David nodded, too weak to argue. More footsteps. 2, maybe 3. Coming fast. Thomas reloaded, moving from cover to cover like it was Fallujah all over again. His heart pounded like a war drum. Every instinct he thought he'd buried with his uniform came roaring back. These weren't soldiers. They were assassins, sent to erase a mistake. He peeked around the hallway corner, another figure. This one had a silencer. Professional. But Thomas didn't give him the chance. One quick shot, then another. The second figure crumpled silently to the ground. But it wasn't enough. Another entered through the front, spraying bullets indiscriminately. A mirror shattered. The wood cracked. Thomas ducked behind the kitchen island, bullets whipping past his head. Ranger came bounding out of the smoke, blood on his fur, eyes wild. He leapt straight into the path of the attacker and took him down in a vicious tangle of limbs and teeth. It wasn't clean. It wasn't quiet. But it was enough. The room fell still for a moment. Then a sound pierced through the fading chaos. David's voice. Weak. Hoarse. "Thomas, behind you." Thomas turned just in time to see the last man. Larger, slower, but aiming straight for his chest. There was no time to shoot, but there was time for Ranger. The dog launched himself once more. The shot rang out. Thomas screamed. Blood hit the wall. Ranger hit the ground and didn't move. The cabin was suddenly quiet. Too quiet. Smoke lingered like ghosts in the corners, and the smell of gunpowder clung to everything. Walls, clothes, skin. Thomas stood frozen for a second too long, staring at the motionless body of the last attacker slumped against the wall. But all he saw was Ranger. The dog lay crumpled on the wooden floor, blood seeping from his side, staining the old boards where he used to sleep at Thomas's feet. His chest rose barely. A shudder. Then stillness. Thomas dropped to his knees beside him. "No, no, no, stay with me, boy." His voice cracked, breaking past every wall he'd ever built inside himself. He pressed both hands to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was deep. Too deep. "You saved me. You saved us." Ranger's eyes fluttered open for a moment. Just a moment. Enough to meet Thomas's gaze, as if to say, "I did what I was trained to do." Then he let out a soft, low breath and didn't take another. David had crawled out from beneath the floor, eyes wide, body trembling. "Is he?" Thomas nodded once, jaw tight, face wet. He stood slowly, knees shaking, rage bubbling up in place of the grief. They came here to finish the job. But why? What the hell could be so dangerous that they'd kill an officer, fake his death, and hunt him across the country? David leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. "It's the files, Tom. The ones I saw in the bunker. They weren't just about us. They were about something much bigger." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "How big?" David swallowed hard. "Joint operations with private contractors. Off-the-books missions. Civilian casualties that were erased. And names. Not just soldiers. Politicians. CEOs. Journalists. Anyone who got too close." He took a deep breath. "They buried it all. That drone strike wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. And I wasn't supposed to see it." Thomas paced the room, fists clenched. He'd served his country with honor, risked everything, watched men die for flags and orders. But this was betrayal. "We need to get that information out," he said finally, "to someone who can expose it, but not through official channels. They own all of that. David nodded weakly. There's a name. A journalist. Ana Velasquez. She's been chasing the story for years. I never gave her anything. But she's the only one who might be able to do something with it. Thomas looked down at Ranger one last time, pain carved deep into his face. Then he turned to David. We're finishing this. For him. And outside, somewhere beyond the trees, another engine started. They weren't alone. They buried Ranger at dawn, under an old pine tree behind the cabin. Thomas dug the grave with his own hands, blood mixing with dirt. Every motion a silent vow. No ceremony. No flags. Just a soldier and his brother in arms saying goodbye the only way he knew how. David stood beside him, leaning heavily on a cane Thomas had carved from a fallen branch. Neither of them spoke during the burial. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been lost in the smoke and blood of the night before. When the last handful of earth fell, Thomas stood back and saluted, jaw clenched, eyes burning. You saved more than my life, he whispered. You reminded me what it means to fight for something real. They didn't have much time. The hard drives David had pulled from the bunker were wrapped in canvas and stashed in an old military duffel. David had insisted on carrying them, even though he could barely walk. If I'm the target, they'll follow me, he said. You drive. I distract. But Thomas refused. You're not bait. Not again. We do this together. They loaded the truck. No plates, no GPS, just a tank of gas and a paper map. Old school. Undetectable. The destination was clear, New York City. And one woman, Ana Velasquez. Ana had been writing about military corruption for years. Always just on the edge of the truth, never with enough proof. David had followed her work secretly, hoping one day he'd be able to tell her everything. That day had come. Thomas drove through back roads, switching routes every 2 hours. Every rest stop was timed, every turn calculated. The air was thick with silence. Between them, around them, not fear, purpose. Ranger wasn't with them anymore, but his presence lingered like a ghost in the cab of the truck. Halfway through Pennsylvania, they noticed the car. Black, tinted windows, 2 lanes behind, always keeping pace. We've got a tail, Thomas said, tightening his grip on the wheel. David reached for the handgun beneath the seat. Then let's not lead them to Ana. Thomas nodded. He took the next exit, then another, weaving through a maze of back roads until they hit a dead end. A field surrounded by trees. He cut the engine. The black car stopped behind them. 2 men stepped out. No masks this time. No subtlety. One of them held a silencer. The other held a lighter. You're not walking away from this? The taller one said, stepping forward. Thomas glanced at David. We're not here to walk away, he replied, reaching slowly into the duffel. Not for a gun, but for the hard drive. And in that moment, David hit send. The email had gone through. Thomas saw the confirmation flash briefly on the old satellite phone screen before the taller man fired. The shot struck the phone, shattering it into plastic and sparks, but it was too late. The files were out. Ana Velasquez had them. Thousands of pages, logs, images, videos, names. Proof that couldn't be buried under flags or medals. The men in black froze for just a moment, realizing their mission had failed. And that hesitation cost them. Thomas moved first. Years of training kicked in. He tackled the gunman to the ground while David, with shaking hands, fired once at the second attacker, grazing his shoulder. Chaos erupted in the still field. Blades of grass caught fire from the lighter dropped in panic. Smoke rose quickly, blurring the vision, masking the fight. One attacker fled. The other lay unconscious at Thomas's feet. David leaned against the truck, out of breath, the gun slipping from his fingers. The fire spread faster than they could contain. Flames devoured the field around them, the sky turning orange and black. We have to go, David shouted, coughing. But Thomas didn't move right away. He looked down at the fallen man and realized something. They weren't soldiers. They were cleaners. Not sent to win, sent to erase. And they'd failed. You tell whoever sent you, Thomas muttered as he stepped away. dragging David toward the road. That the truth doesn't die just because the people who carry it do. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, sirens could be heard in the distance. Emergency crews, local law enforcement, maybe even people who still cared about justice. David collapsed just feet from the tree-line, and Thomas caught him before he hit the ground. "I'm sorry," David whispered, "for everything I couldn't stop." Thomas shook his head, voice tight. "You did more than enough. You gave them the truth. That's more than most ever do." Weeks passed. The files went public. Anna published a full exposé, front page, national coverage. Congressional hearings followed. Careers ended. Lives changed. Not all answers came, but enough light poured in to break the silence that had blanketed their past. And through it all, two names were never forgotten: Captain David Carson and Ranger. Thomas never returned to the service. He didn't need to. He'd served his last mission the only way that mattered, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves and honoring those who gave everything, even when the world tried to erase them. And every year, on the same morning, Thomas visits that tree behind the cabin. He kneels beside the grave, lays a medal on the soil, and whispers, "You kept me alive. Now the truth keeps you alive too."